Because as a leader, you've got to be careful about losing it. You've got to be careful about firing back. You also got to be careful of your own pride. Dadgummit, I ain't going to have anybody talk to me that way. Well, then you better find something else to do other than leadership. Hello and welcome to the Christ Church Leadership Podcast in the Wesleyan tradition. I'm Charles Kyker, your host, and I'm joined by our staff here at Christ Church, and I want to welcome you and thank you for being a part of this time together. I'm going to be referencing Jenni Catron in her book, Culture Matters. I'm going to share 8 essential principles for helping to build and or rebuild your culture. To make it effective and stronger. She says culture is an outcome. It's an outcome. And sometimes it's not always what we want. In other words, if we really look honestly at our culture, it may not be where we'd like for it to be. So what do we do to help it get there? And she opens up chapter 10, which is where I'm getting 8 of her essential elements of building or rebuilding your culture and moving forward. She has a quote from John Maxwell, who's been a mentor of mine for 37 years. John says the single biggest way to impact an organization is to focus on leadership development. There is almost no limit to the potential of an organization that recruits good people, raises them up as leaders, and continually develops them. And our one-year Bible reading for the day is it's amazing because Jesus is teaching here, and he says to the crowds, he says to the folks, he gave the following illustration. Can one blind person lead another? Won't they both fall into a ditch? Students are not greater than their teacher, but the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying, friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite, first get rid of the log in your own eye, then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. And then lastly, these few verses, he says, a good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. A tree is identified by its fruit. Figs are never gathered from thorn bushes. Grapes are not picked from bramble bushes. A good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart, and an evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. What you say flows from what is in your heart. These words are very important as we open up and break down what Jenni shares in her book, Culture Matters. I really appreciate this quote. She said, the single biggest way to impact an organization is to focus on our sense of systems and people. If you develop good people managers, to be able to develop good people managers in equipping people. All too often, we focus so much on systems and having good systems, which systems are important. Systems help the organization hopefully run smoothly and get the output that they're designed to get. But we forget, I think, all too often, we're in the people business. And I would say those of us in nonprofits who are Christian-based and those of us who are in the local Christian church, we're in the people business. But I would also have to say, because we're defined by the singular message of the gospel, we're in the people redemption business. Our goal is to see people's lives redeemed, to be made whole, for lives to be restored, for relationships to be strengthened, for people to live more into the redemptive purpose that God has created them for. And so we want to develop good people managers, but you've got to lead people, not so much manage them. And that's what I think is the farce, frankly, and I'm just trying to say this observationally. I'm not trying to criticize, but observationally, if I may be so candid and honest, so many MBA programs and so many business schools will have courses in leadership. It's not really leadership. It's management. It's how you manage the organization. It's how you get a preferred outcome. And that has its place. So please understand me, and I'm not being highly critical. But in leading, you're actually leading people. In order to lead people, there's some essentials that have to be in place. And I believe those essentials are noteworthy. It's like I said in our message this past Sunday when John Maxwell first said this in 1997 when I was at Asbury Seminary. I'll never forget it. We were in the Beeson program. John came to teach. This is before he wrote the book, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, became a household name in 2001. So John was teaching about 20-some of us in the Beeson program, and he said, people look for three things in a leader. One is, can I trust you? Can I trust you? Second one is, do you care? Do you care about me? And the third thing is, are you competent? If I get on your bus, am I going to go anywhere? If I'm with your organization, are you going to help me to improve? Can I go up in the organization, or can I at least grow as a person and as a leader? Those three things are very, very important. And we've got to accomplish the first two. People will sometimes even stay in an organization even if they don't feel they're growing dynamically as an individual. But how do you accomplish the first two? I think you really have to build trust by doing trustworthy things, following through, being a person who's real, being a person who is authentic, and then actually caring for the people. And you can go around and tell people you love them all day long, but unless you actually live into that, spend some time with them, listen to concerns, issues, whatever the case may be. And then if they're in a crisis, you walk with them through a crisis. They don't walk alone, you walk with them. And that's paramount if you're going to build trust. And I think that's essential. So let's move on to how do we develop good people, because we want our culture to be strong. The first thing she talks about is self-leadership. Self-leadership, consistent growth. You have to take the intuitive nature and realize that sometimes we have blind sides, and it's important that we realize that. And we realize that we have to be aware of our own insecurities. We have to be aware of our own idiosyncrasies, our own habits, our own things. John Maxwell has said for years that he has challenged CEOs of major 50 Fortune companies, 100 CEOs, 100 of the largest companies in the United States or in the world. He consults with them, and he says, it's important to, at least among your senior leaders, if not your entire group of employees, and some of these are major corporations, so that they won't just have hundreds or thousands of employees, they'll have tens of thousands. But at least among your major direct reports and your management, it's important that you share from time to time how you're working with maybe an issue of your own personal development, your own growth, revealing that you are aware of your blind side. And so to share some of your vulnerability. And after his talk on that, during a break, he might be signing books or whatever, and he'll have these CEOs come up and say, hey, John, thank you for your teaching today. But that last part you shared about sharing my frailties or sharing my, some of my struggles or some of my character flaws that I'm trying to overcome. He said, I'm from a different generation. We just don't do that. And John says, well, you're making the mistake of assuming that they don't know your character flaws, or they don't know your weird habits, or they don't know some of your issues. They know. They talk about them all the time around the water fountain and at the coffee breaks, and they just want to know that you know. And if you share them, they're like, oh, good. He knows. That's good. That's a relief. We're glad that he knows. But self-awareness also includes EQ, emotional EQ. And that is, Andy Stanley has a talk on this, the founder of a very large church, North Point in the greater Atlanta area, and has multiple campuses. Andy talks about when you're the most powerful person in the room. And if you are an influencer, are you aware that you could inhibit input? You could inhibit pushback. And if you want to welcome pushback, you want to welcome input, you've got to set the stage for that. And you've got to let other voices speak. So you have to be aware of how you come across to other folks. Now, I think suffice it to say, many leaders don't want to come across as being either too bold or too confident or unapproachable. You fill in the blanks. But perception sometimes is reality. And sometimes people may perceive us that way. And it's helpful to know that some people are a little hesitant about offering feedback or engaging in things because they do feel they're in the presence of a very strong personality, and therefore they feel like, well, I don't know if my opinion matters. Well, your opinion does matter. So how can we be self-aware as an influencer that we're giving opportunity for feedback? And emotional intelligence is incredibly important. She calls it the superpower of the best leaders, emotional intelligence. And that's her second one. It kind of goes right along with self-leadership. But the second principle is emotional intelligence. How do you grow emotional intelligence within your organization? We've talked for decades and decades about IQ. You want to have smart people around you. You want to have smart people. But I like emotional intelligence to be brought into the picture because emotional intelligence is can-do people. They have a can-do attitude. They have a conviction that they're not necessarily the best, but they want to be the best they can be. They have a certain confidence, not so much in themselves because that can be cocky and arrogant, but a confidence that what they're doing is worthwhile. What they're doing is very important. And what they're doing can have a major impact in people's lives. And your emotional intelligence has a lot to do with how do you see yourself and are you comfortable in yourself? So when somebody comes up and challenges you or challenges the organization, when somebody comes up and maybe even attacks you, and I've had that multiple times in 43 years of ministry, am I able to say within my very spirit, I don't know what's going on. They may be going through a personal crisis. We talked about this recently in one of my groups. We called it Rooted. It was a study, and we were focusing on grief. And I said, there are multiple stages of grief, and people go through grief in different ways. You can move across town and be going through grief. You can have a family member move away and you're grieving. You can retire and be in deep grief because now it's like, oh, snap. What do? I don't go to this place anymore and work 9 to 5 or whatever. You also can, of course, be going through grief if you lose a job or if a job has been eliminated. Now you've got to totally shuffle and go through something else. I remember my father went through a great deal of grief when the Greensboro Daily News transitioned totally over from the old system of printing newspapers to a whole computerized system. And he had to just take books and books home, and he had to learn how to be effective in his job. And it was, he was in his late 40s and early 50s when they were going through this major transition. And it caused a lot of stress. It caused a lot of grief. People can be short-tempered. They can jump to conclusions. They can come at you. And they're going through grief. and it could be separation and divorce. There's lots of reasons for grief. So if I have a high emotional IQ, I've got to sit there and think, I don't know what she's going through. I don't know what he's going through, but I'm going to just relax here and ask some questions. Like, now let's back up a little bit. By the way, good morning. How are you? And let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. And your goal is not to put the person in their place, but to find out what place they're coming from when you're feeling attacked, or you're feeling like the organization's being attacked, or they're angry or whatever. Because as a leader, you've got to be careful about losing it. You got to be careful about firing back. You also got to be careful of your own pride. Dadgummit, I ain't going to have anybody talk to me that way. Well, then you better find something else to do other than leadership. And now you don't want to be talked that way. I don't want to be talked, but I'm just saying it's going to happen. Question is, what do you do with it? How do you process it? And if you have a strong emotional, I think about people, Delta Airlines, for example. I had a chance to be in a group of 20 people one time with Ed, who's the CEO now of Delta Airlines. It was through John Maxwell, and we had a round table, Ed Braswell, and he talked about the transition from Northwestern coming into Delta as the senior VP, right under and then the president, right under the CEO. And I know him to be a fairly humble man, to be so talented and gifted. But when Delta has had some recent issues, and there have been some airline situations in the recent news, a lot of CEOs, a lot of airlines have been attacked. And Ed can't start screaming at the camera, losing it. He has to do what I think he did the other day and said it's still the safest way to travel. There are some issues going on, and those issues largely have to do with air traffic control. Now, we're concerned about that because those are our partners. We work together. And Ed did a brilliant job of just trying to say, here's where the issues are, and we're concerned about it, and we want to, of course, do our part in making sure air travel is safe and good for everybody else. And I thought he led extremely well the other day when he was interviewed. So understanding who you are and your emotional intelligence is very important for self-awareness. She has 5 things under emotional intelligence: self-awareness, 2, B, self-management. Self-management. How do you manage yourself? Because that's part of self-leadership. You've got to manage yourself. Only you can lead you. And then C, social awareness. That's that part I was mentioning earlier. Whenever how are we perceived by others? How are we perceived by others? How will others perceive us who may be in different situations in their life? And then relational management. How do you deal with people relationally? The third essential in helping to create a healthy culture is communication. Communication. And this is the single biggest people issue, is communicating. Is communication and what is taking place. You have to ask a couple questions. Who needs to know? What do they need to know? And how quickly do we need to get this out? So when something happens, who needs to know? Who needs to know about this? What do they need to know? Because you don't necessarily have to tell everything, but you still have to keep people informed. And then how quickly do we need to get this out? Now, you might attach some other things to that, but I think it's important to say, all right, who needs to know? Who needs to know about this? And then what takes place? In Christ Church, we're one church in multiple locations. Sometimes something happens very campus specific. And so I don't know that always we need to communicate everything to every campus. But if something's happening at that campus, then we definitely need to communicate something to that particular campus that may involve parents, or it may involve lay pastors, or it may involve life groups, or a change in some kind of meeting or gathering. Then that campus, of course, needs to be fully informed, or the people involved. But then do we need to inform every campus? Sometimes we do. Sometimes it's like, no, I just think we need to FYI that particular campus in this situation. And so you have to ask those questions. whenever Maxwell's senior leaders interviewed Jenni, they confessed John Maxwell's recognized as one of the greatest leaders in the entire world, and we still have a communications problem around here on a regular basis. And Jenni just jumped in and said, the old rule used to be you have to communicate something 7 times before people get it. She said, I think it's 27 times now. It's 27 times. And I never will forget John Maxwell, from those of us that taught Equip for years, his nonprofit leadership around the world, and I've been a privilege to do that since 2006. John called us together when the pandemic started. And by the way, happy 5th anniversary for COVID and the pandemic. Today is March 25th, and Christ Church opened up worship on March 27th. Parking lot worship. March 25th, the governor of the state of North Carolina sent 100, because we have 100 counties, 100 sheriffs, a fax, email, communication saying churches can do parking lot worship. We got that on the front. We'd already planned to do it, but it's nice to get the okay, because then you feel like you're legal, right? But we got that okay on the 25th, and then we opened on the 27th to do parking lot worship at all of our campuses. But John said, when we all were on a big Zoom call with him, he said, during a crisis, you have to over communicate. Over communicate. And the other thing is, he said, and Joe Sangle said this too, who was our advisor for our capital campaign at the time, people will always remember what you do during a crisis. They'll always remember what you do during a crisis. And sometimes you have mini crises, M-I-N-I. They're not always like major. And people do remember how you act or react in those situations. So communication's very, very important. I love what George Bernard Shaw said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Amen to that. Number 4 is the decision maker, making decisions. How do you make decisions? What is the protocol? Who do you go to get a decision made? Who do you go to? And how quickly do you need the decision? And I think that needs to be, it goes back to communication, that needs to know. It would be real helpful for me when people send something and say, could I get a decision made by Friday or by Wednesday of next week? Because there are sometimes people have sent me something, but they don't put a deadline on it. They don't let me know. And then they're frustrated because I didn't shoot it right back. Well, I'm sometimes praying about a situation or trying to think it through, and I don't just immediately respond. I rarely ever do that, because I let stuff settle for a little while, because your emergency does not have to become my emergency. And I've had so many people over the years come in and say, Pastor Charles, I got an emergency. Well, okay, I want to hear that, and I want you to be heard, and I want you to be seen. But your emergency does not have to become my emergency. And another thing I found really helpful when people want to see me because there is an emergency or there's a decision that has to be made, can I give you 3 things that are incredibly helpful that I'm going to start requiring of everybody that wants to come see me? We used to do it years ago and we got away from it, but we're going to get back to it. Number 1 is, what's your problem or your issue? Clearly define it. Number 2, what are 3 suggestions that you have been thinking through about how to solve this problem or this issue? What are 3 things you're going to bring to me of ways that you could solve the problem, work through the issue, or have a preferred outcome? What are 3 suggestions that you have? And then the third thing is, pick the best one out of that. Over the years, a lot of people have canceled appointments because they thought it through. They maybe took it to a colleague and said, what do you think about this? And pretty soon they were like, well, I don't know if I need to. Now, if it's something that, we've got to go through the system, get the proper approvals, and if it requires funding or whatever, sure, we'll go through that. Number 5, delegation. Delegation. Delegation is a word that I'm comfortable with, but I think you want to empower people and not necessarily delegate, But if you do delegate, or in particular, if you do empower, then you got to give them some power. In other words, you got to give them the ability to make some decisions on their own or do some things on their own, because then it's not really delegation. And I think that's real important, but delegation is very important. I'd like for you to do this, and then you check in with people. And then that's number 5. Number 6 is accountability. Accountability. Gen Z and Gen A really want accountability on a regular basis. They want feedback. And you don't have to wait for a yearly review. Jenni goes on to say it can just be in conversation. Hey, last time you and I talked, last time our team met, you said you were going to have 20, possibly 20 people that you might get to help and be involved in that initiative or that ministry. Where are you right now in your recruitment? Oh, you've got 11. That's great. That's great. Excellent job. What's your plan to get the other 9 over the next 2 to 3 weeks? Are you working on it? Working on that. I'm going to make some calls. I'm also got some other people. Great. I just wanted to check with you. You see, accountability is vital, and accountability is freeing. Here's the other thing, and I've said this for years, and I believe it with all my heart. If nobody ever holds you accountable, then you don't count. Let me say that again. If nobody ever holds you accountable, then you don't count. If I come in at 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 nights in a row, or 3 mornings in a row, do you think my wife is going to wonder where I've been? Of course she is. I'm going to wonder where I've been too, because I can't stay up that late. But nonetheless, if I was to come in at 3 o'clock in the morning, she's going to wonder where I've been. And she has every right, because we're in covenant together, to say, what's up? Did you have an emergency? Was there a pastoral call? Was somebody in a wreck? What's going on here? She has a right to hold me accountable, because I would hope in her eyes, I count, I matter. We matter as a couple. We matter as a married couple. So accountability should be a reassuring thing, not something where you say, hey, wait a minute here. Well, are we in covenant together or not? Are we a part of a team? And so if we are, then there can be and should be accountability. Now, there's proper accountability, and respectful accountability. If you want to hold a senior leader accountable, do it respectfully. But there's nothing wrong with asking questions. But accountability is incredibly important. The next in these 8 is feedback. Feedback. And I just mentioned the importance of feedback, but I think feedback is helpful for all of us. And I think feedback also is not just giving feedback like, hey, you did 3 things incredibly well over the last 3 months. There's an area, though, that I'd like for you to consider working on or improving in. And that kind of feedback is helpful. But I think the organization as a whole needs feedback. I think if you're leading a nonprofit, they need to know, hey, what went well last month? What are some things that you achieved? What are some things that you really went well? Around here, we call them yay gods at Christ Church. What was a yay God? What was man? That was done well. And then here's some things that we're working on, and we're working on our communication. We want to do things well. I just went in the last 3 plus weeks. I just asked for input from our lay pastors. I asked, what do you like about Christ Church? 2, what's a criticism or a concern that you have? And number 3, how are you going to pray for Christ Church? And I've got a lot of feedback. I also got feedback from the staff when that question's asked. I've been reading and praying over these. I'm going through my second time of reading them and praying them through, because I want us to address this issue here at Christ Church on how to create a healthy, strong culture. And some people have said they think the music is too loud. I can't possibly believe that. And some say it's not loud enough. So you just kind of have to weigh all that in, But feedback. Feedback is the breakfast of champions. Find a way to get more feedback. Embrace it. Ask for it. Want it. Don't run from it. Now listen, when somebody gives you feedback through maybe some discontent or maybe whatever, be careful about dismissing it. If there's anything Dale Galloway ever said to me that still just hangs in my heart and mind, he says, be very, very careful of either minimizing or dismissing your critics and what your critics say. Because your critic that's saying something at the time that you don't want to hear may actually have truth for you, may actually have some very important feedback. And just because you don't like this person, or just because they didn't do it in a positive way, just because they were not kind or loving when they gave it, doesn't mean it's still any less true. And so be careful about disregarding the feedback or criticism you get from a critic. And then last is ownership. Ownership. This is critical in any organization. I get a little weary sometimes when somebody's been a part of Christ Church for many years and may even be what we call a lay pastor, what I would call a stakeholder, that uses language like, you all might want to be doing this, or you all might want to consider this, or they might want to do worship that way. And it's important to help people realize we need to change you all or they to we. Because all too often people are thinking about they instead of this is a we thing. And Jesus talks specifically about that in the Bible, where he talks about certain shepherds. Some of them are hirelings. They're just there to get a check, or they're just there for the recognition or whatever, or they're just there for their own agenda. But when the wolf comes, they run away. When the wolf comes, they're out of here. Only the shepherd stays to protect the sheep. Ownership is absolutely critical. And I find that the more we're willing to invest in people and then give people responsibilities, and then the more we believe in them and help them achieve certain goals where they feel like, yeah, I was able to be a part of this and it went incredibly well. And then they'll have more ownership over time and be able to say, you know, I'm a part of this ministry. I'm a part of this organization. I'm a part of this team. I'm part of this business. And what we're doing is worthwhile. But ownership is critical. And moving people to ownership sometimes is one of the biggest cultural hurdles that we face, because a lot of times people are resistant to have ownership because ownership also means responsibility. I'm responsible. I can't just do what's convenient. Sometimes I have to go the extra mile. You know you have ownership when you have second mile folks. You know you have ownership when people have a mindset of, we'll do whatever it takes. Now, as a leader, you can't take advantage of that. People are going to need a day off. People are going to need some rest. We have a big run-up in the church up until Christmas Eve. We had a big run-up up until Easter because of Holy Week. And we always specifically give a week of rest intentionally after that. We try not to have any meeting schedule. We try not to, because we've sprinted. But during that time, we want ownership. What are you doing to build or rebuild the culture at your organization, your nonprofit? Culture Matters. Get Jenni's book. Read it. Discuss it with your senior leaders. But above all, reflect upon your own leadership and ask, what can I do so that people can learn to trust me more? What can I do to care more for the people that I'm with, and how can we be more competent in what we're doing? Thank you for being a part of the podcast.